Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to continue our Old Testament survey as we look now at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. You remember we left off with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 586 BC, and that begins this period of the Babylonian captivity. Now we can trace those years in a variety of ways. Either we can look at the time when the temple was destroyed. Notice the return from exile is going to begin around 539, 538 BC. That's not a 70-year captivity. The 70 years is from the destruction of the temple all the way to the completed rebuilding of the temple in 516 BC. So that's going to be our 70-year captivity. It's the 70 years when there is no temple standing. Once Nebuchadnezzar dies, the kingdom of Babylon begins to go downhill, and it begins to go downhill rather quickly. And added to that is a new power that is beginning to arise, a power of both the Medes and the Persians, and that comes to fruition with the rise of a king by the name of Cyrus, who, according to tradition, his father is a Persian and his mother is a Mede. And so he takes these two kingdoms and merges them into what we are going to call the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Cyrus is attacked by the Lydians, and Cyrus responds by marching all the way to Lydia and capturing King Croesus at the famous Battle of Sardis. Sardis is located way up high on a cliff, and the story goes that, as told by Herodotus, that the city of Sardis had been surrounded by Cyrus and the Medes and the Persians, and they're looking at this huge cliff with the fortress on top, and not knowing how they could possibly get up there. While they're looking at that, one of the soldiers happens to drop his helmet off, and it goes bouncing all the way down to the bottom of the wall, and then all the way down to the cliff. And so the soldier sort of looks around, and then he climbs over the wall and climbs down the cliff using a hidden pathway that wasn't immediately observable to anybody from down below. That night, Cyrus sends a contingent of his Medes and Persians up the same path over the city walls and captures the city, captures Sardis, nearly without a fight. Hundreds of years later, in the New Testament, Jesus would give a message to John the Apostle, who writes in the book of Revelation a letter to that same city of Sardis. And he says to that city, "Wake up!" Not because you have invaders from the Medes and the Persians, but wake up because of the spiritual decline that you are suffering. Well, once Lydia falls, that leaves the Medes and the Persians in control of nearly everything from India all the way to the Mediterranean. And Babylon is the last city to fall, and does so in the year 539 BC. When Cyrus comes to the throne, we read in Ezra chapters 1 verses 2 and 3, he issues a proclamation, and we have a recording of it here. "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who's in Jerusalem." Now it sounds like this as though maybe Cyrus is a believer. Although we have found the same testimony, the same statement made by Cyrus, not just to the Jews, but to all sorts of other national peoples with other gods. In other words, he comes on the scene and he says, "I'm the great liberator. Any of you who have been dispossessed by Assyrians or Babylonians, you can all go home. Be happy. Don't forget to send in your taxes. We're going to be one happy empire." He goes on to say, "Every survivor at whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God which is in Jerusalem." Like I said, he gives the same sort of statement, not just to the Jews, not just about Jerusalem, but to many different peoples, as he portrays himself as the great liberator of mankind. Now, Cyrus has what he's done. He's given the Jews, as I said, other peoples too, but he gives the Jews permission to go back, and they are given permission to go back and rebuild the temple. And they do that. Well, not all of them do. Actually, it's a fairly small percentage of the larger Jewish population, but a number do. They go back in the days of Zerubbabel. They are led by one of the descendants of the kingly line, that is a descendant of King David. He's not going to be a king. He's just a leader. Maybe we could call him sort of a local tribal leader, not even really a governor. But they go and they begin to rebuild the temple. And that goes on for a while. But then in the days of the son of Cyrus, Cambyses, the construction is halted. And it's halted because of some of the political maneuverings. There is a governor up in Samaria, and initially he said, "Oh, good, I like temples. I'm going to help you guys build your temple." And the Jews say, "Well, we really can't have pagans involved in this. Thank you, but no thank you." And he gets offended, and so he takes action and has the construction halted. And the temple stands there in a state of disrepair, in a state of half constructed and half not, for years and years and years. And it's not until the days of another king, when the prophets Haggai, Zechariah suddenly get up and they begin to prophesy and urge the construction to begin again. Now, the Jews don't have permission to do that. They've been forbidden to continue with the rebuilding by the king of the entire empire of Persia. But Cambyses, in the meantime, has died. There's a new king on the throne by the name of Darius. Now, he hasn't said you can build. He hasn't said you can't build. But without permission, Haggai and Zechariah, and if you want to know specifically what they say, you just have to read the books Haggai and Zechariah. We'll do that when we get to them. And they prophesy and urge the construction to begin again. And the Jews obey the voice of the Lord. They begin building, even though they don't have permission from the emperor of Persia. And when news gets back that they are building, there's a call, wait a minute, are they rebelling? And the king, the new king, whose name is Darius, he orders an investigation to be made, not only of the action of the Jews, but an investigation made of the records concerning the past status of this temple. And he finds out that Cyrus had indeed given permission. Darius says, okay, you can have permission, continue the work, complete the work, and not only that, but the local taxes are going to help pay for it. And so the temple is completed in the year 516 BC, 70 years, I won't say it's necessarily to the day, but exactly 70 years after it had been destroyed. Now, when we look at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, one of the things we need to note is the books are not necessarily written, or those three books don't necessarily take place in a straight chronological order. That is, the first 6 chapters of Ezra detailed the return unto Zerubbabel that we just described, the rebuilding and completion of the temple. Those years from 538, 539, Cyrus actually comes on the scene, and then he gives his edict very early the next year. So 538 to 516 BC, which is when the temple is completed. You turn the page in the book of Esther and you jump forward something like 50 or 60 years. However, what has taken place between chapter 6 of Ezra and chapter 7 of Ezra are all the events described in the book of Esther. So if we were reading it in chronological order, we would read first the first 6 chapters of Ezra, then we would read Esther, and then we'd pick up Ezra again and pick up again in chapter 7. Now, that would not be a topical arrangement, but that would be a chronological arrangement. However, because the Bible's presented the way it is, we're going to approach it topically instead of chronologically. So we're going to do the same thing. We just talked about what was in Ezra chapters 1 through 6. As we go now to Ezra chapters 7 through 10, a number of years passed, and now we see Ezra the scribe, and he is involved in bringing another group of returnees back to Jerusalem, and they get back to Jerusalem, and there's, people are back in Jerusalem, the temple's been rebuilt, but everything isn't quite as orderly, and that's what Ezra is doing. He's calling the nation to sort of finish up its repentance, and to put sin outside the camp, and especially there was a problem of intermarrying, where the priests would begin to take wives from other folks who were in the land who were not Jewish, and who might not have the same religion of the Jews, who are worshiping maybe other gods. And so there's a call to purity that takes place when Ezra comes on the scene. Next we get to Nehemiah. Now that's short on the heels of Ezra. As Nehemiah, he occupies an important position in the government of the Persians. He's cupbearer to the king, and that's not just the guy who waits on tables. That's we would call him maybe Secretary of State or something like that. And he gets permission to take a sabbatical, to take a hiatus from his duties, and he leads a third return. So we've actually got 3 returns. Remember how we had three times where the Israelites are taken away into captivity? We could call it 3 captivities. First Daniel, then Ezekiel, then the general population. Likewise, we now have 3 returns to the land. First under Zerubbabel, second under Ezra, and now I'm going to refer to this as a third return, where Nehemiah comes back, not with a giant group, but a good-sized group of people. And under Nehemiah, the walls of the city are now restored. The walls of the city of Jerusalem are rebuilt. And this takes place around 445, 444 BC. Now, the next book we're going to look at after this is the book of Esther. As I said, it takes place there, in between the first half and the last half of the story of Ezra. But now we're going to look at the Esther narrative. First of all, we ought to note the cast of characters. First of all, there's Esther. Actually, her Jewish name is Hadassah, but she has both a Jewish name as well as a non-Jewish name. I guess you could call it a Persian name. Esther, or named after Astarte. That is one of the, I guess what the Greeks would call Aphrodite and the Romans would call Venus. They called Astar. And so it's a pagan name. Then there's the king, and he's going to be called Ahasuerus, and most scholars agree this is the same king that the Greeks know as Xerxes. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his Persian name. I would mess it up terribly. But we'll refer to him as Ahasuerus, and he's the king of Persia. Thirdly, there's 2 other characters. There's Mordecai, who is the relative to Esther, maybe a cousin, maybe an uncle, and then there's Haman, and Haman is the bad guy. He's the villain of the piece. Now, the story begins where a new queen is going to be selected because the old queen, didn't quite measure up. She, went through a little rebellious period, and husbands don't like that. In this case, the king doesn't like that. And so he wants a new queen, and to do that, he's going to have a beauty pageant. And Esther wins the beauty pageant, and she's going to be the new queen. And Mordecai is all excited about that, and he's sort of hanging around the palace whenever he can send a message to his cousin. And in the process, Mordecai overhears a plot to assassinate the king, and Mordecai sends in a report, and the guilty parties are arrested, captured, put to death, and Mordecai has effectively saved the life of the king. However, there's a problem, and that is Mordecai, when he's sort of hanging around the outside of the palace, he doesn't show proper respect, at least in Haman's opinion, to Haman, and Haman begins to get a little upset at Mordecai and what he sees as a lack of respect, and he's not groveling on the ground and what have you. And so Haman decides he's going to have it in for Mordecai, and not just for Mordecai, but for all of Mordecai's people. He wants to just not only take out Mordecai, he wants to take out everyone who is Jewish. And now he doesn't know that this new queen, that Esther is Jewish. In fact, that seems to have been kept a closely guarded secret. And so Haman is concocting a plot, not only to kill Mordecai, but he goes to the king and he sells the king on a plan. He says, look, if you got rid of all these Jewish people, we could go in and take all the things that they own, and they're sort of troublesome anyway, and they rebelled against the Babylonians in the past, and you don't like people who rebel. So if you will proclaim sort of anti-Jewish day and we can go kill all the Jews, then we can get all their stuff and get all their money, and you'll have lots of money in your coffers, and you won't have to raise taxes, and you'll be a really popular person. And he sells the king on this plan, which really doesn't speak too highly of the king, but that's okay. And so this is his plan for what we call in nowadays ethnic cleansing. He's concocted a plan that will result in the death of not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. And Mordecai goes to Esther and says, you've got to do something. She says, I can't do anything. I'm only allowed into the king's presence if he calls me, and he hasn't called me in quite a long time. He's got all those other wives and concubines and things like that, and he's busy with other things. And he says, it might be for such a time as this that you were chosen. Now, an interesting thing about this, God is never mentioned directly in the Esther narrative, but if we're saying, Esther, you were chosen for such a time as this, somebody did the choosing. And so I think the idea of God is there and his providence, but God isn't specifically mentioned. And so Esther finally agrees. And meanwhile, Haman's been developing a plan, and Haman's plan is that on a certain day, and word's already gone out for this, that on a certain day, all the Persians would just, attack all of the Jews and kill them all and get all their stuff, and that way they can increase the taxes without anybody having to actually pay the tax, except the dead Jews who won't really, mind that once they're dead. And Haman has a gallows already set up for Mordecai, and he's really got all this taking place. Meanwhile, one night the king can't sleep, and he does what some people do when they can't sleep. You get something boring to read, and in this case, he's got old news reports and old palace files that are being read to him, including this time when Mordecai passed the word about the assassination attempt and saved the life of the king. And so the king calls on Haman the next day and says, Haman, what would you do for somebody who you wanted to just honor and shower with glory? And Haman is thinking, well, he must be planning on honoring me. And he says, well, O king, this is what you ought to do is take such a person and dress him in the finest, clothes, and put him on your horse or your chariot, and sort of parade him through the city and say, this is how the king treats somebody that's in his great favor. And Haman's already sort of sizing himself up for a new suit of clothes and thinking how well he would look on the king's chariot or the king's horse. And the king says, that's a great idea. I want you to do that for Mordecai. Mordecai! I didn't want to do it for Mordecai, but the king's already spoken. Meanwhile, Esther has invited the king to a party, and then, and when he came, has invited the king to another party, sort of softening him up, and Haman has been invited too, and Haman's thinking, well, that last thing didn't go so well, but maybe this will go better, and Esther reveals that the king has been put into the position of putting her to death because she's Jewish. The king didn't know that. And the king goes out to check on things and comes back. Meanwhile, Haman has come to Esther and said, "Oh no, you've got to help me. This looks like it's going bad." And the king walks in and thinks maybe he's doing something improper to his bride, and the king says, well, we're gonna do away with you. And some of the servants say, well, there's gallows outside, and before he knows it, Haman has been strung up on his own gallows. So that at the end of the day, the Jews are delivered. Now, the word's already gone out that they can be attacked, but another word goes out saying that they can defend themselves. And that takes place and the Jews are delivered. And instead of dying, it becomes a great victory for them. Now, when we get to Esther, and I've just given you sort of a superficial overview of the story, we get to Esther chapter 9, verse 24. We read, "For Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite." And this is not the only time he's described that. It's repeated several times throughout the book of Esther that he is a Agagite. And you wonder, what on earth is an Agagite? And if you remember way back in 1 Samuel, we ran into somebody named Agag. He's called the Agagite, the adversary of all the Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is the lot, to disturb them and to destroy them. And if we remember that connection, that explains what is the connection of the book of Esther to the earlier historical narrative. You see, Haman seems to have been a descendant of Agag, and you're supposed to remember that. He's been described that in Ezra 3, chapter 1, and all throughout he continues to be referred to as Haman the Agagite. And Agag was the king of the Amalekites, whose life Saul had spared in disobedience to the command of God, that time when Saul was rejected from being king by God, by Samuel. The central figure there had been Agag, the enemy of the people of God. And now, by contrast, we have the actions of Esther and Mordecai, both who are from the tribe and family of Saul. They are not only Benjamites, they are Benjamites directly related to Saul. And Mordecai and Esther are going to be the savior of the people of God. So that the book of Esther is a redemption story, not just saving the Jews, which it does, but overturning that bad thing their ancestor had done, Saul, in the past, who initially tried to allow Agag to live. And what he had done in the past now has come back to haunt the Jews. And remember, if Haman has his way, not only will all the Jews die, but if all the Jews die, there will not be a Messiah, because the Messiah had to come from the seed of Abraham, from the tribe of Israel, from the family of David. And so, if Haman has his way, there will be no Messiah, and if there's no Messiah, then we're all dead in our sins. So, what is at stake is not just Mordecai and Esther, it's not just the Jewish people, it's the entire human race. And this becomes the story of the salvation of the world. Some points to ponder. Esther is the book of God's providence. As we said, God isn't even mentioned, but he has his hand in it, and he's working out the details as God still works out the details of our lives. And this, as we pointed out, the success of Haman's plot would also exterminate the seed through which Messiah would come. So Esther's story is our story. It's part of what God has done for us. And this book reminds us that God works in the lives of both the great and the seemingly small. Indeed, somebody wrote a book with this title quite a few years back. There are no little people. Everyone is important. I think also we see a picture of Jesus. In the story, Esther was the virgin bride who married the king, and the church in the New Testament is the spotless bride who marries the king. In the Esther story, the queen's former wife had been displeasing and had been set aside, and we read in Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11 how the natural branches were broken off due to unbelief, so that we, some of us who were Gentiles, could be grafted in. In the Esther story, Haman plotted against Mordecai and against all the Jews, and we know that Satan has set himself against Christ and against all his people, indeed I would say against all mankind. In the Esther story, Mordecai convinces Esther to intercede on behalf of her people. And we have an intercessor. Jesus himself interceded on behalf of his church. In the Esther story, Esther agrees to intercede after the people have fasted for 3 days. And of course, Jesus, Christ, interceded on our behalf and then was in the grave for 3 days. In the Esther story, Haman plans to have Mordecai executed for not bowing down to him. You remember how Jesus was tempted by Satan to worship him, and Satan's attack culminated on the cross, which became not our defeat, but our great victory. In the Esther story, Haman met his end on the gallows that he had intended for Mordecai. And in our greater story, Christ intentionally went to the cross that was prepared for us, that was deserved by us. He died our death so that we could live his life. And that's the greatest story of all. In both cases, that which looked like certain death and defeat was turned into ultimate victory. Our victory.